Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this critically important conversation, Transitioning Cities, Achieving a Net Zero Future for All. My name is Andrew Snowhite, and I am a Senior Strategy and Sustainability Advisor at NewCities, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So first, a little background on our topic. The urgent need for our transition to a net zero economy puts cities on the front lines of physical and systemic transformation. Cities produce more than half of the world's emissions, and reducing these emissions would have a significant impact on the fight against climate change. But as a new report from McKinsey Global Institute shows, reaching net zero emissions isn't easy and will require enormous economic and societal adjustments. What will this transition to net zero look like for governments, cities, corporations, and citizens? And who's going to pay for it? This conversation will explore what the net zero transition in cities will entail and how research, policy, and private sector innovation can help support and promote progress toward a healthy and sustainable future for all. So now for some introductions. Again, I'm Andrew Snowhite, and I focus on environmentally and socially sustainable cities and communities, and have worked on several ambitious greenfield urbanization projects, including Songdo and Neom. We've got a really wonderful group of people with us today. Brody Boland is partner at McKinsey & Company. Allison Brizius is commissioner of the Environmental Department at the City of Boston. Tadashi Matsumoto is the head of Sustainable Urban Development at OECD. And Alyssa Muto is director of Sustainability and Mobility at the City of San Diego. Welcome, everybody.
Good morning.
So I'd like to first ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves to the audience. And let's just go, we'll start with Brody, followed by Allison, Tadashi, and Alyssa.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So Brody Boland, I'm a partner with McKinsey & Company based out of our DC office, although I'm Canadian. So, I lead our work at the intersection of climate and the built environment. So do a bunch of work with cities, with infrastructure investors, real estate investors, banks, kind of the whole operators, the whole built environment ecosystem, developers, constructors. And then I've also led a bunch of our work, our research on this topic. So I've worked with organizations like C40 Cities to do research on both mitigation and adaptation in urban environments. Have led a couple of the McKinsey Global Institute research projects on both physical climate risk and socioeconomic impacts of that. And on the topic today, the net zero transition. So really great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you all, and hello. Thanks for having me here today. Really excited for the conversation. My name is Allison Brizius, and I am the Environment Commissioner for the City of Boston. In the Environment Department, we focus on a broad range of initiatives, including our climate resilience and mitigation carbon neutrality work, but also our conservation and wetlands protection, air and noise pollution, zero waste initiatives, historic preservation, and archaeology. So really a range of initiatives there, but obviously very relevant for today is our work on our transition and our net zero commitments, and really broadly across the city as a whole, how that will be a just transition and consistent with the mayor's vision of a Green New Deal for the city.
Was it me?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry. So welcome and nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Tadashi Matsumoto. I'm heading a unit of urban sustainable development at the OECD. So my work is related to all the aspects of cities and urban sustainable development, but particularly given the OECD is a multilateral organization, we are looking at how national government and cities can work together to achieve the goal of sustainability. My personal strength or specialty is actually urban planning and governance. And so looking at this multi-level coordination is a perfect match with me. Just one word that one of the major projects that we are doing is called a territorial approach to climate action and resilience. I'll give a link to the chat So if you're interested, please contact me for more information. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I am Alyssa Muto. I'm the Director of the Sustainability and Mobility Department at the City of San Diego. I revealed that I'm in West Coast time, so for those of you across the world, good afternoon, good evening. My department is comprised of 3 pillars of climate action and climate equity, which includes all of our goal setting under Mayor Todd Gloria of a net zero by 2035. Inclusive are the actions that we plan to undertake to get there as a city, as a region. Additionally, we have the pillar of energy, which includes electric vehicles, really starting at the source of the electricity that we will need to convert those cars and to provide charging for our historically underserved communities, as well as our municipal energy transition and retrofits, and our own utility franchise cooperation and agreements here in San Diego. The last pillar is the mobility pillar. Really putting that with sustainability was a big move for us because it is an area that we need to do more in Southern California, is in the mobility space. And our mobility team is comprised of everything from our long-range policy engineers to ADA, curb space and parking, and of course in scooters and micromobility. So thank you so much for having me here today. I really look forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you all. That was wonderful. And I think that what I'm really excited about in terms of this conversation is we're already starting to see that there's all these different components when we talk about net zero. And I think that this group is going to be able to talk about that, both, what's affecting us domestically here in the States, but also regionally and around the world. So for everyone who's joining us, if the audience has questions, please do submit them via the chat. And if we have time, we will address them before we wrap up. So we're just going to jump in and get started. And Brody, I'd like to ask if you could please share with us, a few key highlights of McKinsey's recent report to get us started.
Yeah, no, sure, happy to. And the report is a bit of a tome, so I will stick to the highlights. So the background of the report that recently came out, which is around the net zero transition, we did a piece about 2.5 years ago on the socioeconomic implications of physical climate risk. And so that was really grounding in the actual physical consequences of climate change, what that's going to do to our infrastructure systems, to our transportation systems, to human survivability in certain areas, to our food production systems, and key grain stocks and failure, agricultural systems. And so that was a bit of the bad news, right? Around physical climate risk. This report basically tried to ask the question, what's it going to take, right? What's it going to take to get us on a 1.5C pathway in a real systematic look through all of the different parts of the economy, right? Obviously there are various different pathways or various different expectations. This one was a kind of NGFS 1.5 degree scenario. So what would it take to get us to 1.5C and net zero ultimately? The short version of the answer is what it's going to take is a fundamental transformation of all of our social and economic systems. The fundamental transformation in the built environment, in land use, in transportation systems, et cetera. A couple of the components of that. So one, it's going to take a massive mobilization of capital. So if you look at kind of annual capital investment in the built environment, we're moving from about $5.7 trillion a year in annual capital investment to about $9.2 trillion a year on an annual basis. So that's like a $3.5 trillion annual increase in capital investment, which is pretty chunky on a 5.7 baseline. In addition to that, there's about a $1 trillion reallocation of existing capital spend. So not only are we going to have to increase the capital we spend to change all these systems, we're also going to have to reallocate some of the capital we already spend. So I think, number one, a huge capital reallocation. Number two, a real labor mobilization. We're looking at about 200 million jobs gained and about 185 million jobs lost globally. Now, obviously the net on that is positive, but the transferability is not clear, right? So there's going to be a bunch of dislocations in employment for a lot of folks around the world, and we're going to have to grapple with that and figure out how to manage that. What's interesting there is that's actually kind of comparable to some of the other mega trends we see. So things like automation has a similar amount of labor dislocation. So the third thing, it's not evenly distributed. Different countries, different geographies, different cities will be affected more than others, right? Some stand, and so we're going to have to manage that inequity, that access to ensure a kind of just transition as we go over the next couple of decades. And then last, it's going to require a real multi-sectoral cross-institutional transformation. It's going to require everyone, right? It's going to require governments setting policies, incentives. It's going to require finance, reallocating capital, changing how we, provide debt, changing how we invest. It's going to require businesses coming up with new business models, starting new things, changing operations. And it's going to require civil society, right? Folks involved in their local communities, changing the way we live and work on an ongoing basis over the next decades. So it's a pretty big task. I think we didn't kind of directly assert that it's doable, but I think the idea would be that's the challenge before us, and I think the spirit of this conversation is hopefully how we can get it done. Absolutely.
So I think it's hard to tackle anything without a plan. So I think it's fascinating to hear of all of this information, that you at least were able to distill it down to a few core buckets, so to say, and from there, start to understand where the challenges really lie. So I think I'd just like to open up to the other panelists to give some quick reactions. What resonated with you in terms of what Brody just shared with us.
I think maybe I'll start at the city level, and the report was fantastic. So Brody and all of the folks at McKinsey, what an important report, what a great report to talk about the dollars and cents of the policy that we need to put in place. And there were some real inspirational points and some real scary points. And in cities, we hear that often as we bring forward our climate policy, what that looks like to our general funds, to our revenues, to how we position ourselves for government money from our state and federal level. But I think it also notes that in the, your first bucket, the universal, it has to happen at all levels and all spaces. And so where cities can really participate in this and should is preparing those ambitious plans, centering equity to minimize those inequities that will eventually come, to create partnerships, and then most importantly, to invest comprehensively with our staff and our resources and our budgets across our municipalities, and lead by example. So I really think there's a place, even though the report is at such a high level sectors and countries, we can take a lot and adapt it down to our city level.
Great. Allison or Tadashi, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I can join. So I would also like to congratulate the report, and also a bit of reactions to perhaps the financing angle. So we see like three major ways or approaches to how to accelerate this financing net zero transition. So first one, obviously, this is one of the key messages of the OECD as usual, aligning the way how you spend the money. particularly looking at tax, of course, collection, so spend, and also how to raise revenue. So this alignment of expenditure and revenue is very important. For example, some example is that Netherlands is currently making a very strong adjustment, going out of natural gas to more electricity, and then actually using tax power to putting a higher tax into the gas, and then also slightly lowering tax on other electricity production source. So this is one important thing. However, of course, these are like large scale transition, and it's, of course, needs a lot of considerations for many, especially social aspect. The other two, quickly. First one is really looking at the existing spendings and greening these spendings. This is very important, particularly, for example, one of our report looking at green recovery measures is telling that only 21% of the total COVID-19 recovery spending that we studied in the OECD and key partner countries are actually spent on environmental positive measures. So actually, all the other parts of this remaining funds are used, in fact, not so much environmentally positive part. So actually, these are the areas that we could look at. Then a final point is actually looking at maintenance cost. That's also very important. So shifting priorities, if you are continue to spend your money for green infrastructure, shifting it to other purposes. I think a McKinsey report was referring to nature-based solutions. I think this is also a particular area of focus, but also other areas like looking at school building maintenance, for example, not just spending as usual, but adding a little extra fund to make energy efficiency retrofit, for example. Yeah, so shifting a little of the priority of existing fund would create a sort of new fund. So I stop here.
Yeah, I'll just add my thanks, Brody, for this important report. I think it absolutely highlights a lot of things that we've known that have been invested in our plan, have been critical pieces of our planning for many years, but it elevates the interconnected nature of all of these systems and the level and scale of investment that we need now. Cities, we see we are on the front lines, we are on the ground, we are going to be implementing the land use planning, the policies, ensuring, responsible for ensuring many critical components of this just transition for our residents and for the workers and the businesses of our city employ. So much of it is about understanding where those larger global resources need to come into play, but directing them with the folks that are on the ground and are needing to act right now to move this transition along. We know another thing that the report highlighted was the timeline, right? These are large systems that have inertia and take time to adjust. So the investment now is more critical and more valuable. The dollar today, the ton abated today is much more critical than the one 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And so pulling that forward and highlighting also how interconnected the systems are when you're designing not just for emissions reduction, but for a just transition, for transportation access, for healthy homes, many of these interconnected systems.
So, Brody threw out some pretty massive numbers, talking about trillions of dollars on an annual basis. So I think there's this really, obviously the really big question is, where's that money going to come from? And then as you've all been noting, how do we then prioritize which programs, we're going to use, say, if you're a city, or, if you're working in a larger regional space. So there's that priority choice too. Brody, is that something that you might want to talk about a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, and I would love to hear also the other
Yeah.
colleagues on the panel on this, because I know a lot of you are actually making these prioritization decisions on a day-to-day basis. I mean, one of the things, Tadashi, that I think you said, which is really interesting and important when it comes down to prioritization, you mentioned things like nature-based solutions, and you mentioned things like the maintenance spend that's already happening that you can like tilt by 5 degrees to get a real different level of impact. You mentioned the example of a school retrofit, rather than having to come up with a whole new bucket of cash to pay for something, right? And I think, finding those opportunities where there are multi-X benefits from a given dollar of spend becomes really important. And, whether it's, hey, we need to retrofit the school anyways, let's put in a heat pump, or whether it's, hey, we need to make this resilience investment, let's also make it a park, or a transportation corridor, or some other multi-X kind of outcome. I think that those are some of the things where you can make the most of an existing dollar of spend, that allows you to kind of hit multiple targets at once. And a lot of nature-based solutions are in that category, right? So many nature-based solutions, you get the mitigation benefit, you get the adaptation benefit, you get the livability benefit, you get an equity benefit. There's a thing about nature which is pretty great on multiple dimensions. But yeah, I'm super curious to hear what others.
Yeah, I was going to say if Alyssa or Allison have any comments on that, but also I'm sure the audience would love to hear about since we're talking about nature-based solutions, any nature-based solutions that have been effective in your cities as well.
Sure. In Boston, we are absolutely focused on nature-based solutions and just that embedding of multiple benefits and taking advantage of those natural opportunities in capital cycles and improvements to get the most benefit for the buck, as you can go. So we are a low-lying city at great risk, 47 miles of coastline at risk to flooding now, and increasing flooding with storms, increasingly strong storms and sea level rise. So we have been doing a lot of resilience planning to look at exactly what you said, is how do we build a park on the coast that is a park, that functions as a park, and it is just a hidden resilience piece of infrastructure in the city. It has stormwater retention, it is elevated gradually away from the coast so that folks can enjoy the park and enjoy their connection to the water those 95, 99% of the days. But then that park becomes a piece of critical protection for the neighborhood behind it in this increasing storms that we're going to see. So we're looking to really lean in on those nature-based solutions and those multiple co-benefits as much as possible. But you still have to figure out, the joint infrastructure investment. So we'll build the park, you build it into the capital plan, but you're still going to need that collaboration from the state, from the federal agencies to bring those investments at scale. Because if we just wait for the capital planning cycle for 47 miles of coast, we're going to be out of time. We're going to have to move some of these things more quickly than we would otherwise in order to get the protection in place.
Yeah, and I think similar to the examples that Allison presents on coastal San Diego is a coastal city. But I think when we have looked at resiliency, one of the priorities being equity, is recognizing our communities that have historically been underinvested in, underserved. Those will be the hardest hit first. So looking at those green solutions in our more urban communities that are set back, 10, 20 miles from the ocean. So they're not far, but they still are very vulnerable to extreme heat days, to flooding that happens in the tributaries that lead out to the Pacific Ocean. And so finding those solutions through the government monies that are coming down in billions and trillions right now, to states and local governments, which we are all so appreciative of, but you have to do that really thoughtfully. You have to do that from a multidisciplinary perspective when it comes to a municipality. It can't just be happening in the sustainability mobility department. It has to come from engineers. It has to come from the operators, the management of those assets of a city. And then it has to come from the community. Is that what they need and want? Is that where they feel the inequities presently today, and targeting those investments? We've also looked at our policy as a city and how we reinvest our development impact fees. So as development comes into parts of our cities, we receive additional fees and money from those developments. But those developments are happening in areas that are much higher income, that are newer, that don't necessarily need significant investment. They probably need investment here and there, but the significant investment. So how do we redistribute those citywide monies to address those inequities that help us to be more sustainable and resilient, like parks, like tree canopy, like cool pavements, and green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure. So I think that's really where we look to tackle both the sustainability and resiliency piece. But it's a riddle. It's a complex problem that's going to take really complex solutions to get there, and the funding, it needs to come from everywhere. It needs to come from partnerships. It needs to come from governments, and it needs to come from innovation.
Just a few words to complement, or from a bit different perspective, from a national government perspective. Well, actually, a support from national government is still very, very important to really support and accelerate city action that was well described. One is that, of course, of financial support, and community is very important, but also actually some national governments are recognizing the community-led activities. Of course, the US is one of the examples, but I see Australia, Canada, new fund developed for particularly focused on climate adaptation, but community-led process. So this is something that how to connect really like funding coming from national, but really to the needs of the community. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we've made the connection, and maybe we can jump a little bit more onto this idea that, first of all, we're talking about trillions of dollars. And, some of us are fortunate to live in areas of the world where our government can give our cities billions or trillions of dollars. But there's a lot of the world where that's simply not the case. And that's a lot of the world where we're going to see major shifts in populations and the number of people moving to cities over the next few decades. So how are we going to address, I think, regional needs and challenges, kind of like Alyssa said, from a city basis, but if we're really going to look at that from a just and equitable transition, on the country level, especially in places like the Global South.
I'm happy to pile
Please,
on.
I would say it's a tough question. So I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but go for it.
I'll throw myself at the breach. Maybe, and this isn't a solution, this is maybe more of the problem, but adding a bit of urgency to the problem. The other thing I think that is really, like Andrew, to add on what you were describing just now, I think we underestimate the pace at which there's going to be a massive capital shift, like at our peril. And what I mean by that is that if you are in a boardroom of most of the major institutional investors or major banks around the world today, they are starting to do real substantive granular climate risk analysis now, right? And they are starting to discover risks from climate change that have been non-transparent up to this point. And so they're realizing certain cities, certain geographies, certain plots of land within cities, certain countries are at far higher risk than they previously thought. And this is happening in a matter of months, this is happening as we speak, right? And you have a whole bunch of, in these boardrooms, you have a whole bunch of moments that as the risks are realized. And so I think one of the kind of piling on, Andrew, onto what you said, one of the things we have to do is figure out how we can avoid a real damaging capital flight from some regions that are most disproportionately affected and actually need that capital to successfully make the transition. And I think, the clock is really ticking on our ability to do that globally. I think, Tadashi, you probably have some thoughts on this, but I think multilateral investment is really critical. Development investment is really critical. Innovative blended finance models where you have, some concessionary capital that unlocks much broader capital and maybe provides some protection for these major capital sources that may otherwise want to pull their capital and put it in a safer spot. So that's a little bit around the finance side of the challenge, but it feels to me that we need to be coming up with and scaling those kind of solutions yesterday.
Maybe I can follow up a little bit. So I think this is not a very easy, not at all easy task, especially talking about rapid urbanization. Of course, it's easy to say that, okay, try to do a leapfrog project, or perhaps, invest now than 10 years later. I think one very important thing is really to understand or to talk with people and understand that if you don't invest now, then actually so many, maybe 10 times or 5 times more cost. Money is necessary to fix the problem, so don't delay the problem now. So this is a very important message. And another thing that I still think that the vision setting from the national government is still very useful tool, although it's not a money issue, but actually creating a national urban development framework or vision, which is, clearly or explicitly mentioning the goal is net zero, or, the zero carbon transition within urban policy is very, very important, because in many countries we see, this collaborative governance at the national level is not always happening in these countries. Meaning Ministry of Environment does their climate net zero goals, but urban development agency or ministries are not so much, keen to it, or, short of instruments to engage climate goals within their national urban policy. So the link is still very important, and there we have a lot to support actually.
I would just add there, as you talk about ideas about swift capital transitions or shifts in investment, or who can afford to quickly decarbonize their homes or their vehicles or things like that, is where cities and states and federal governments and philanthropy, all of these elements are so critical. And what Alyssa said is so critical about connecting with local environmental justice communities and populations. We have the role and the responsibility to ensure that our affordable housing is affordable and protected and going to be sustainable and resilient first, that our environmental justice populations that are at risk of flooding or heat burden, the investments are going there first to make sure that that these communities that have disproportionately borne the burden and not reaped the benefits are at the front of the line in this transition and not left again behind. So critical to combine the policy and the alignment with the speed of this potential capital investment and capital transition.
Yeah, I think, Brody, it's interesting that you say that there's this kind of, the light bulb's gone off in these boardrooms. And I think for a lot of us, our optimistic side will say, oh, that's great. that means that they're recognizing risk and the capital's to be placed in the right place, versus, oh wait, there's too much risk, we're gonna pull our money out. And I'm wondering on the city, from a city perspective, for Alyssa and Allison, it's one thing for the public sector to invest in the types of areas like Allison just mentioned, but how do you engage the private sector to, once they start understanding these risks, to not pull capital and projects from the areas that might need them the most? Is that something that's come across your conversations yet?
It is. It's definitely started. Well, so there are a couple of different ways that we look at this, and at a city level, land use policy is climate policy. That is the lever that we have most at our fingertips. So making land use from that investment, from the investment in our neighborhoods, makes sense for development to continue, for labor to have good paying green jobs, and for our communities to have, as Allison mentioned, housing that is affordable, housing that is secure, and housing that is green and sustainable. And so working in those policy areas, as I mentioned, with our development impact fees, that's one of our primary areas that we are looking at to reevaluate how money is moved around our city, looking at our city citywide. It's not 52 different unique communities. We are one city. Another way that we're looking at this is through our taking electric vehicle and the conversion of folks from combustion engine to electric vehicle. One of the ways that we are going to move forward with this is to move forward with a request for interest, get some more information from the market. We've already done quite a bit of information gathering, but we hope to move into a charging as a service program in the city, and bringing in a charging company as a partner who will invest into those communities where maybe if it was a one-off of, go put charging in community X, it doesn't really pencil out. So if you look at things more citywide, that comprehensive view perspective, and then working regionally. So we are very close coordinated on decarbonization with our regional government as well. And I think, partnerships and going back to the McKinsey report, we have to come together to ensure that the funding and the solutions and our residents, these are sectors, these are jobs, but these are at the city level, they are our residents, they are our people that we need to be mindful of.
I want to transition to partnerships real quick. Does anybody have anything they want to add before we do that? So I think that, as Alyssa just said, this is so complex. It's complex on a hyper local level, let alone the complexities that grow when you start talking about regional and a global scale. So how do we build these partnerships? Are there examples of some partnerships that you all are excited about, that you're a part of, that I think might be interesting for the audience to hear, in the role that you have day to day? Who wants to go first?
Well, this might be not the kind of partnership you're talking about, but I would say that partnership regionally is critical. We have very close connections with our other region, as I said, regional governments, other cities in the metro area, partnerships with other cities across the country or across internationally. We don't have time to be all individually reinventing the wheel for ourselves. We need to be absolutely taking the great idea that worked in San Diego and pulling it to Boston, and then exporting an idea that's working in Boston to Phoenix or somewhere in the global South, and then pulling up a resilience strategy from there. This is so critical. So we're in maybe more networks than we can count to be doing that sort of rapid best practice sharing as much as possible. And that obviously extends to strategic partnerships with philanthropy or with nonprofits to bring in those ideas from those other sectors as well, because we only control, we do have land use policies, but as a city or as a state or as a federal government, we only control so much of the puzzle and so many pieces, and it does take that partnership with community members, with business to move these actions forward.
Partnerships.
Yeah. So as Allison, there are so many partnerships that our city has engaged in, and I think let's pull it apart a little bit from a staff level. So our workers within a city, they have to be behind this as every bit as much as the mayor, our elected officials, our state and federal. So some of the programs from the local perspective are those professional affiliations, engineering and how we really reassess our built environment is going to take industries, it's going to take professional affiliations to help us to get everybody looking in the same direction. From my level, I've had the opportunity and the fortune to represent the city of San Diego on the European Union International Regional and Urban Cooperation Program. I believe Allison's city is also part of that. It is a really fantastic way that we come together with our partners in Europe, in all throughout North America, to share ideas, to convene, to not reinvent the wheel, and to create those networks. The world is a very, very small place now. We can have webinars and we can have conversations so much easier than we could before the pandemic. So for the bright side of that. And then from our elected officials having, COP26 and the Conference of Mayors and other networks where the elected political conversations can be had and the visions can be raised and developed that should be able to inspire across the world and to affect change, not just in our own cities and our own countries, but in partnership with those countries that maybe can't support this transition in the same way, because they're one of the things about the McKinsey report I thought was very interesting is talking about the percentage of GDP that's in various sectors and how that alone, I mean, forget the country's GDP, but where they've invested that the technology and the infrastructure and the resources and the workforce will definitely play a part in whether or not they will be able to sustain that transition. So I think it's through those networks that we have in place and just refresh of how we use them.
One example of a partnership that I thought was cool to build off something, Melissa, you were saying. You mentioned the kind of built environment and decarbonizing the built environment. There's a few projects like this happening around the world, but just to take one example, there's a big office building, major, under development or kind of early pre-construction phase. Big US city, or about it or the project, and they have an aspiration to be net zero, right? And they're just not being able to make math work in terms of, adding up all the additional costs of the electrification of the building and the, utility savings, and they just haven't been able to make the math work. And so we were chatting with them and realizing that a lot of their project partners have also made these kind of net zero commitments. And on that kind of flagship new construction project in a major American city with premier corporate tenants, if you can't make the math work there, it's going to be pretty darn hard to make it work anywhere. But their lenders have made net zero commitments. And we know from their lenders' perspectives that for them to meet their net zero commitments, they need to get their real estate, emissions down by 2030, if they're going to be on track. And their equity investors have made their net zero commitments because they're big pension funds. And the city has made a net zero commitment. And so, bringing on this project, all of the different stakeholders together and essentially sitting around a room together and looking across the table and saying, okay, bank, you've made this commitment. What can you do here to help us out? Okay, equipment provider, you have a lot to gain in scaling your heat pump business. What can you do here to help us out? Okay, building designer, what innovative methods would you, okay, city, what kind of allowances could you potentially give, or, a little different zoning, and essentially on a specific tangible project where the rubber is really hitting the road, getting all the stakeholders in the room. And you end up coming up with really creative solutions. You end up coming up with things like, okay, well, if the bank was able to really verify this as net zero, we could package it in a green bond and get, improve our capital attraction on the back end and, offer you a little bit of a lower interest rate, and that kind of stuff. So, an interesting example where getting a whole bunch of folks in the room can unlock opportunities to make progress where it may not otherwise have occurred.
I can add what we are doing as networks. Of course, it's a multilateral networks. Well, we try to really make a little bit different from the global city networks because, of course, using the OECD vehicle, meaning basically we have a convening power of national government and connect cities and national government. So one series of meeting that we are doing is called OECD Roundtable for Mayors and Ministers. So even in some countries or in many countries actually talking between mayors and the mayors and the ministers directly is not so easy to do, right? But if OECD or some other organization can give a place, like a neutral place where you can discuss different policies, very technical issues, not a political one, but more like looking for technical solutions would be nice, and it has been appreciated by many people. And also we are looking at with great interest of the development of urban 20 networks. This is and also this week actually we had a meeting of U7 Mayors Summit in Germany. So this is something that G7 has a different ministerial meeting at the national level, but also at subnational level, mayors from G7 countries are gathering and then try to come up with some messages that can be brought to the national level from the city level. So this is very interesting development, and we are supporting that activity. Same for U20 for G20. And so the key message here is how we can support delivering city message to national government as a partnership.
Great. I think those are excellent examples where you have, elected leaders coming together. But, I think we see on you going down, that's on a city level, but going down to a building level, we need collaboration between the different stakeholders and subject matter experts to really, have a chance at achieving these goals. So I want to talk about the citizen piece of this. We've talked about businesses, we've talked about governments, funding and so forth. I think for all of us, we're practitioners of this. We live and breathe net zero, but I'm wondering what the feedback is like from citizens. Is this race to net zero something that's on their radar? And how has the last 2 years, which have been so challenging for so many people all around the world, impacted their thought process in terms of what net zero means to them and how it will impact them? folks. Allison, you want to go?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's varied, right? There are many residents that are very concerned with climate change and aware of the city's goals and supportive of a just transition and a green transition and making these investments to get to net zero and many things. But we also, we've seen through the pandemic and other places, the same folks who are hit hardest by the pandemic that are struggling to recover are going to be continually and repetitively hit by the impacts of climate change if we aren't acting proactively and now and continuously to make sure that they and their needs are at the heart of a just transition, right? And when you're talking to residents, these, you know, pretty abstract ideas about carbon dioxide and methane are not the front of mind concern. It's paying the rent, it's energy cost burden, you know, paying the utility bill as prices go up, it's jobs. And so it's our responsibility as we're doing the big policy strategic thinking to also be responsive to those needs and not showing up to say, hey, I'm here to talk to you about carbon emissions, but say, let's talk about how this affordable and sustainable housing can give you rent stability, and these solar panels or this efficiency investment can help with the utility bill and the air quality that are your concerns that we're hearing. So that is very much a part of our job, is to translate and combine those efforts to be meeting the on the ground immediate needs of the residents while planning for the future.
Tadashi talked about community-led process, and I think that's been one of our focus points. Net zero emissions, that's a term that's, you know, something that we hear, probably everybody on this webinar are very familiar with. The average person, the average citizen is not familiar with what that means. They want to know, well, so does that mean you're going to plant some more trees? Are you going to make the bus on time and efficient for me to use as an option? Can I safely bike around a community? Where do I put my trash? Oh, you want me to put it in a new color bin because that's from my table or from my yard? Those are the issues that the citizens are familiar with. So one of the ways that we've approached our climate action plan update is to start with a very deep engagement, even though it was right smack at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, working with community-based organizations to get more feedback about what climate equity looks like to residents, to build out our strategies from a very technical perspective, quantifying what GHG emissions could be avoided or mitigated. And then what are those actions? And it's in those actions that's where those tangible pieces for the citizens, for our workforce, really will start to come together. So we're doing that in parallel, but we'll get the policy forward and then move forward on a very detailed implementation plan for all of those about 170 actions and counting that we know are the near-term needs, as well as the long-term, to reach our goal of a net zero by 2035. And we still, you know, we can't get the math there yet. And we've left a holding space for that too, because I think to not set the ambitious goal, we can't do that anymore. So we set that ambitious goal, but we also have a place that we can keep putting in new ideas and then moving those ideas to the more concrete places in our action plan.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump right back in there just to elevate that one point, which is that it's about not just showing up and saying, we have decided what the priority is, and it's net zero. It's about hearing and being and working in partnership, in joint governance with folks to say, okay, you have elevated your critical priority. Let us address that and let us work in how we increase resilience as we achieve that. How do we make those immediate, real-time, transformative, ideally integrated investments and policies that bring emissions reductions along, but not always to just lead with emissions reductions.
So we've got a few minutes left and we have a few questions. Oh, Tadashi, did you want to answer that?
Well, I was just, yeah, I mean, trying to support what Alisa and Harrison said. I mean, it's really like the key is really to communicate and then also inform people. There are many different ways. I was just preparing my notes and looking at IPCC, latest report on mitigation. Found a very important number here. So just I wanted to introduce. So it's said that urban emissions are like 70% of all the global emissions and so on. Those are the numbers that is spoken. I think maybe this is the first time to see the 2-time series in this report I found. So in 2015, urban emissions. So urban emission estimation, of course, is like 25 gigatons CO2 equivalent. And now 2020, the estimation was 29. And it's increasing in cities. And then also the share is also estimated. So the global share in 2015 was about 62%, says. And then 2020, it's around 70%. So actually, first of all, urban emissions are growing. And then second, the share of the urban emission is growing as well. So just, this reiterates the importance of, role of cities that, is really responsible and also opportunity as well, but it's really responsible for cities to act. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Great. So we've got a couple questions, and some of them are big questions, and I'm not going to sure if we're going to be able to tackle them. Maybe Tadashi, if you could answer this one really quickly. So we have some friends and colleagues tuning in from Lagos in Nigeria, and then we had a question about, for areas in the global South and places like Lagos where they rely on traditional energy resources, and there's been a lot of unsustainable urbanization practices. Where, what are the resources out there that practitioners and developers and so forth can look at in terms of best practices and where funding might come for infrastructure and so forth?
Okay, that's a big question.
The big question. Maybe the question is,
yeah,
without answering the whole thing, is are there any good resources for people to start educating themselves?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think so again, I'm an urban planning in background, and I think what pays off at the very end really is urban form. So urban infrastructure investment and land use is key, right? So actually, before going into any technology solutions or other, let's say, quick win or low-hanging fruit solutions, it's really important for urbanizing countries to look at the basics. And so I just suggest to look at resources which addresses this basic compact urban development, controlling urban sprawl, how to create transit-oriented development, those things. These are really basics, and it's very difficult to fix after urban sprawl. I hope it answers somehow.
Absolutely. So I think it's about time for us to wrap it up. I'm going to ask everybody a little lightning round to button this up. So in a sentence, two at the most, I think a lot of what we talk about can be scary in terms of costs and how we're going to make this all happen. But what's one quick thing that you're excited about as we move towards this transition to net zero cities? Who wants to go first? Excited. Alyssa?
Happy to. I'm excited about, especially just based on what Tadashi just said, I'm excited about the fact that this transition could help make our cities more livable, enjoyable, equitable, prosperous places where everyone just has a better life as a result of the different ways in which our cities look and operate and feel as a result of the transition.
Excellent. Alyssa?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and complex problems will require a puzzle mindset, which I love that idea. But it also will require governments to really seek to be partners and collaborators in the solutions. And that's what I'm most excited about.
I already said this urban planning perspective, it's really an opportunity to transform cities, livable and walkable. And so net zero transition is really an opportunity to transform. Yeah, so that's my excitement.
I think you said it well. We've all got a very unified excitement. It's imagining what is possible when we're designing for these multiple benefits and putting the investment where it needs to be to make these healthy, thriving, just, and resilient cities.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to end on that. So thank you to all of the panelists for joining us. I think Brody put a link to the report in the chat, but if people are watching this at a later time, it's on the McKinsey website. And I just want to say thank you to the audience as well from everyone at NewCities. We appreciate your time, and we will see you again.